A young millionaire helps a homeless woman and her daughter on his way home. However, upon learning the woman's true name, he immediately calls a detective. The low hum of tires on asphalt filled the silence in James Stewart's car. Outside, the Philadelphia skyline loomed in the distance, its lights muted by a curtain of icy rain. He barely noticed the world around him, his mind locked in the mechanical rhythm of his daily commute. Drive home. Shower. Sit alone in the living room with Bella's picture. Repeat. The clock on the dashboard blinked 7:18 p.m. It was later than he had intended to leave the office, but lately he found reasons to linger. The house was too large, too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an echo of what once was. A life lived, then lost. Bella's laughter still lingered in the walls, and he didn't have the heart to let it fade. He adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own reflection. Hollow eyes, a jaw clenched with muscle memory rather than resolve. Outside, the temperature gauge on the dash blinked 4°C. It was a harsh winter in Pennsylvania. As he turned onto the freeway ramp, his headlights swept across a figure on the side of the road. He almost missed it, a small, hunched form under a bridge, framed by a collapsing shopping cart. He eased off the gas pedal. Just keep going, his rational mind told him. It's not your problem. But something pulled him back. He exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel until his knuckles whitened. The car rolled to a reluctant stop 50 feet ahead, the wipers slashing rhythmically across the windshield. He threw the car into reverse and backed toward the shadowed figure. The scene came into sharper focus as his headlights illuminated the space beneath the overpass. Soaked through her threadbare coat, a woman held a small child, wrapped in a faded blanket. The child, a girl no older than 3, huddled against her chest, her face buried for warmth. The woman turned her head sharply toward him, her eyes wide and defensive, like a stray caught in the open. James rolled down the passenger window halfway, the cold air cutting into the car's heated cocoon. "Do you need help?" His voice sounded foreign to him, too soft, too alive. The woman hesitated, her arms tightening around the child. "We're fine," she said, her voice low and hoarse. A lie. Rain splattered onto the armrest as he leaned closer. "You're going to freeze out here." He gestured toward the back seat. "I can take you somewhere warm. Just let me help." The child stirred, her small face peeking out from the folds of the blanket. Big, curious eyes locked onto him for a fleeting moment before retreating to her mother's shoulder. The woman glanced down at her daughter, then back at him. Her resolve seemed to waver. "I don't know you," she said, suspicion lining her words. James nodded, respecting the hesitation. "Fair enough. My name's James. I'm just heading home from work. That's it. No strings." There was another beat of silence. The woman looked at the rain, the sagging cart, then finally at her daughter. With a resigned breath, she stepped forward. "Linda," she said, her voice softer now. "This is Evelyn." James pushed open the passenger door and stepped out to help. Linda, Evelyn. He tested their names like he needed them to mean something. His coat immediately soaked through as he grabbed the cart's few possessions. A duffel bag, some cans, a child's stuffed animal missing an ear, and loaded them into the trunk. Linda climbed into the back seat, cradling Evelyn in her lap. James settled back into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the wheel. He wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else entirely. The scent of wet fabric and a slightly medicinal, hospital antiseptic-like smell filled the car. The silence pressed down, thick and awkward, as the rain drummed on the roof. James adjusted the heat, sending a warm current toward the back. He glanced in the rearview mirror. As they passed a street lamp, The light illuminated Linda's profile, highlighting her sharp nose and strong jawline. He felt a tightening sensation in his stomach, similar to a prodded old wound. He turned his eyes back to the road. "Where were you headed?" he asked, keeping his tone light and neutral. Linda hesitated. "Nowhere, really," she admitted. "Trying to get somewhere better than here." James nodded but didn't press further. He'd been chasing somewhere better for months now, and he hadn't found it either. The car stopped in front of his house, a modern glass-fronted structure that appeared too clinical to be considered a home. The porch light briefly illuminated Linda's figure as she stepped out. James froze, a single thought lodging itself uncomfortably in his mind. She looked like Bella. He shook it off, grabbing the duffel from the trunk. "Come on," he said, holding the door open. "It's warmer inside." Linda followed, clutching Evelyn close. The storm raged on behind them, but James couldn't tell if the unease in his chest came from the thunder outside or the ghosts he had just invited in. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, revealing the expansive interior of James's penthouse. The polished wooden floors gleamed under soft recessed lighting, and large windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing a view of the snow-dusted city below. For a moment, Linda hesitated on the threshold, clutching Evelyn's hand as if afraid to step inside. "Come in," James said, his voice steady but distant. He shrugged off his coat and hung it on a sleek brass rack near the door. "It's warm." Linda led Evelyn across the threshold, their shoes leaving faint, wet impressions on the pristine floor. Evelyn clung to her mother's leg, her wide eyes scanning the cavernous room. The child looked impossibly small against the backdrop of stark white walls and minimalist furniture. Linda's gaze darted from the modern fireplace crackling in the corner to the immaculate sofa that looked as though it had never been sat on. She tugged at the frayed cuff of her coat. "This place is something," she murmured. "It's home," James replied, though the word landed hollow. He gestured toward the living room. "You can sit. I'll find something for the girl to eat." Linda nodded cautiously, guiding Evelyn toward the sofa. The little girl climbed up, her tiny fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the cushions. "Mummy, look." Evelyn's voice was soft, but filled with wonder. "It's so shiny." Linda managed a small smile. "Yes, sweetheart, it is." James disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Linda to settle into the stillness of the room. The space felt cold, not from the temperature, but from its starkness, an emptiness that seemed to echo the life of the man who lived there. She glanced at the mantel above the fireplace, where a single photograph rested. A dark-haired woman, with a radiant smile, looked back at her. Her arm looped around a younger James. Linda tore her gaze away quickly, as though she'd intruded on something private. "Do you live here all by yourself?" Linda asked when James returned, a tray of tea and sandwiches balanced in his hands. "For a while now," he replied simply. He placed the tray on the coffee table, motioning toward the food. "Help yourselves." Evelyn reached for a sandwich, her hands hesitant, until Linda gave her a reassuring nod. As the child ate, her face brightened, the color returning to her cheeks. Linda picked up a teacup, warming her hands against the ceramic. "Thank you," she said softly. James's response was a faint nod, his gaze lingering on Evelyn. She was already beginning to giggle, crumbs clinging to the corner of her mouth. The sound filled the room, a sharp contrast to its usual silence. For a fleeting moment, a shadow of a smile touched James's lips. The elevator chimed again. James's expression hardened instantly as Douglas Stewart stepped into the room, brushing snow from his coat. The older man's presence was commanding, his sharp eyes taking in Linda and Evelyn in one sweeping glance. "What's this?" Douglas asked, his voice clipped. He looked at James, his brow furrowing. "Guests?" James stiffened, but met his father's gaze evenly. "This is Linda and her daughter Evelyn. They needed a place to stay for the night." Douglas arched an eyebrow, his focus shifting to Linda. "I see. And what's their story?" His tone carried an unmistakable edge. Linda shifted uncomfortably, her hand instinctively resting on Evelyn's shoulder. We were just—" "Dad," James interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Let it go." Douglas ignored him, his gaze now fixed on Evelyn. "She's a sweet little thing," he said, though his words felt more like an observation than a compliment. "Looks familiar." Linda straightened, her grip tightening on her daughter. James stepped closer, his voice sharp. "That's enough." The tension in the room thickened as Douglas turned to face his son. "I'm only saying what we're both thinking," he said coldly. "You've brought them here because she reminds you of—" "Don't," James snapped, his voice cutting through the air. For the first time, anger flickered in his usually composed demeanor. Linda stood abruptly, her cheeks flushed. "Maybe this was a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. She glanced at Evelyn, who looked up at her with wide, confused eyes. "We can leave." James's posture softened, but his voice remained steady. "You're not going anywhere," he said, glancing briefly at Douglas before addressing Linda. "It's late, and your daughter needs rest." Douglas snorted, but said nothing further. His sharp gaze lingered on Linda for a moment longer before he turned toward the elevator. "I'll see myself out," he muttered, though his disapproval hung in the air like a storm cloud. As the elevator doors closed behind him, silence returned to the penthouse. Linda lowered herself back onto the sofa, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her tea. James stood by the window, his jaw tight, his reflection blending with the snowy cityscape. "You didn't have to defend us," Linda said quietly after a long pause. James didn't turn. "Yes, I did," he replied. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, something unresolved. "You needed help. That's reason enough." But as he watched the snow fall outside, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Linda's presence stirred something he wasn't ready to confront, something tied to Bella's memory. The thought left him uneasy, but he didn't dare examine it further. Not yet. The next morning, the penthouse stirred with quiet movement. Sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, casting pale streaks across the living room. Linda sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Evelyn, perched on the carpet below, was intently stacking small blocks James had dug out of a storage cabinet. The child's giggles punctuated the silence, like faint echoes of life in a place that seemed starved of it. Linda watched her daughter, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Careful, Evelyn," she murmured as the precarious tower wobbled. "Mommy, look!" Evelyn exclaimed, throwing up her hands as the blocks tumbled. Her laughter rang out, bright and unaffected. James entered the room, tying the cuffs of his shirt. He paused at the sight before him. Evelyn's unrestrained joy, Linda's soft smile, and something inside him shifted, though he couldn't name it. "She's energetic," he commented, his voice breaking the moment. Linda glanced up. "She's resilient," she replied. Her tone carried a quiet weight, as though the word meant more than she was willing to explain. James walked toward the kitchen, hesitating before asking, "Would you like breakfast?" Linda hesitated, glancing at Evelyn, who was now busy organizing her scattered blocks. "That would be nice," she said softly. Her voice lacked the guarded edge it had carried the night before. Later, as Evelyn napped on the sofa, Linda found herself in the kitchen, washing the few dishes they'd used. The penthouse felt eerily quiet again, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. James sat at the nearby dining table, examining blueprints with a frown. "She looks like her father," Linda said suddenly, breaking the silence. She didn't turn from the sink, her voice almost lost under the running water. James glanced up. "Evelyn," Linda nodded. "She has his eyes. She has the same inquisitive look he used to have when he was fascinated by something." Her hands stilled in the soapy water. "He left us before she was born." James set his pen down, leaning back in his chair. "Why?" Linda laughed bitterly, though it was more a hollow exhale than genuine amusement. "He said he wasn't ready to be a father, that he couldn't handle the responsibility." She shook her head. "I should have seen it coming, but I didn't." James didn't reply immediately. He wasn't the type to offer platitudes or sympathy that felt rehearsed. Instead, he studied Linda's profile, the way her shoulders tensed as if bracing for judgment, the slight tremor in her hands as she resumed washing. "He was wrong," James said finally, his voice steady. "You've handled it. On your own." Linda blinked, her hands faltering. She wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply nodded, focusing on rinsing the last dish. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn's laughter began to fill the penthouse again. James found himself watching from the doorway as she darted around the living room, a makeshift cape of dish towels tied around her shoulders. Linda chased her, her own laughter joining her daughter's. It was a scene James hadn't witnessed in years, a mother and child, alive with joy. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, feeling like an intruder on something sacred. "You can play with us if you want," Linda said, glancing over her shoulder. Her tone was light, but her eyes held a flicker of challenge. "I think I'll pass," James replied, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. Linda shrugged, turning back to Evelyn. "Your loss," she said with mock seriousness. For a moment, the warmth in the room seeped into the cold corners of James's mind. But just as quickly, he retreated, his thoughts circling back to Bella and the life they'd planned. That evening, James sat alone in his study, a half-finished glass of bourbon on the desk. He stared at the photograph of Bella on the bookshelf, her smile frozen in time. The laughter he'd heard earlier still lingered in his ears, unsettling him. It was too close to what he used to have, too close to what he'd lost. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, straightening. Linda stepped inside, looking hesitant. "I wanted to thank you," she began, "for everything. You didn't have to help us, but you did." James waved it off. "You needed help. It was the right thing to do." Linda lingered, her gaze dropping to the photograph on the shelf. "She's beautiful," she said quietly. James stiffened, but didn't look away. "She was," he replied. His voice was calm, but the words carried a weight that pressed on the air. Linda nodded, sensing the boundary she'd approached. "Good night," she said softly, retreating to the living room where Evelyn was already curled up under a blanket. Later that night, as James sifted through emails, one caught his eye. The subject line read, "Collaboration Opportunity, Kenneth Martinez." He frowned, opening the message. A real estate mogul proposing a project in Philadelphia wasn't unusual, but the timing struck him as odd. He leaned back in his chair, the gears in his mind shifting. Martinez's name stirred something, an unease he couldn't quite place. Setting the email aside for the moment, he glanced toward the darkened living room, where Linda and Evelyn slept peacefully. Yet, the unease lingered, shadowing the edges of his thoughts like an unwelcome guest. The next evening, the penthouse was unusually still. James stood near the living room window, the city skyline stretching before him in twinkling dots of light. His mind was preoccupied with the email from Kenneth Martinez. The name had lingered like a faint whisper at the edge of his thoughts, elusive but persistent. The elevator chimed softly, breaking the quiet. James turned as the doors slid open, revealing a tall, impeccably dressed man with silver at his temples. Kenneth Martinez stepped out with an air of effortless authority, his sharp gaze taking in the room as if cataloguing every detail. "Mr. Stewart," Kenneth greeted, extending a hand. His voice was smooth, each syllable deliberate. "Thank you for meeting me." James accepted the handshake, firm but wary. "Mr. Martinez, I wasn't expecting you this evening." "I like to handle things personally," Kenneth said with a small smile. His gaze shifted, landing on Linda, who had just stepped into the room with Evelyn clutching her hand. The moment their eyes met, Kenneth froze. Kenneth's confident demeanor faltered, his lips parting slightly as though struck by an invisible force. Linda frowned, shifting uncomfortably under his scrutiny. I didn't realize you had guests," Kenneth said, his voice faint. His eyes didn't leave Linda, though they flicked briefly to the child at her side. "This is Linda and her daughter, Evelyn," James explained. His tone carried a hint of protectiveness, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "They've been staying here for a few days." Linda nodded politely, her grip on Evelyn tightening. "Nice to meet you." Kenneth took a step closer, his gaze narrowing as though trying to place a memory. Then his eyes fell on Linda's hand, where Evelyn's small fingers clung tightly. His breath hitched. "That mark," he said suddenly, pointing. "On your hand." Linda blinked, startled. She glanced at her hand, then back at Kenneth. "What about it?" Kenneth's voice was barely audible. "The butterfly." Linda frowned, her confusion deepening. "I've had it since I was born," she said, pulling Evelyn closer. "Why?" His gaze flickered to her face, his expression growing more intent. "And your mother's name? Was it Heather?" Linda blinked, taken aback by the unexpected question. "Yes. Heather Crawford. She passed away when I was 10. "It's you," Kenneth interrupted, his voice breaking slightly. "It's really you." James stepped forward, his body instinctively blocking part of Linda from Kenneth's line of sight. "What are you talking about?" Kenneth ignored him, his focus entirely on Linda. "Your name," he said, his words trembling. "Your real name is Bella Martinez." The room seemed to constrict, the air heavy with disbelief. Linda's face paled, her brow furrowing as though trying to process his words. "No," she said shakily. "My name is Linda." "Your mother changed it," Kenneth insisted, his voice growing stronger. "To protect you. She fled with you when you were just 4 years old." His gaze softened, the sharp edges of his confidence replaced with something almost fragile. "You're my daughter." Linda stared at him, her hands gripping the back of the chair for support. "Why would she run? From her own husband?" Kenneth's eyes darkened, guilt shadowing his features. "It's due to my own mistakes," he said quietly. "I was involved in things I shouldn't have been. A man named Francis, a criminal, was involved. Heather found out and took you away to protect you." James's expression hardened. "You expect us to believe this?" "I know it sounds far-fetched," Kenneth admitted, his gaze flicking to James. "But that birthmark, it's unique, and I've spent decades searching for her." He turned back to Linda and said, "I've spent decades searching for you." Linda's knees buckled, and she sank into the chair. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That doesn't make sense. My name is Linda. I can't be—" "Think," Kenneth urged, his voice gentle. "Do you remember a blue house? Do you recall a garden filled with roses? She used to sing to you before bed, didn't she?" Linda's breath hitched as fragmented memories surfaced. Brief flashes of color, a melody she couldn't place, a woman's silhouette against sunlight. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched her chest, overwhelmed. James stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Enough. Can't you see she's confused?" Kenneth raised his hands in surrender. "I don't mean to hurt her. I needed to know." Linda wiped at her tears, her voice trembling. "If what you're saying is true, why now? Why are you here?" "I couldn't stop searching," Kenneth answered, "and because Francis hasn't stopped either." His expression turned grim. "If he finds out you're alive, you and Evelyn could be in danger." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Linda's fragmented memories, Kenneth's revelations, and James's growing unease collided, leaving the room tense with uncertainty. "Bella or Linda?" Kenneth said finally, his voice resolute. "You are my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." The words hit like a tidal wave, leaving Linda reeling. James's eyes narrowed, his distrust deepening as he watched Kenneth, silently calculating the risks now shadowing his already fragile household. The weight of Kenneth Martinez's revelation lingered in James's mind long after the man had left. That night, the penthouse was still, save for the quiet hum of the heating system. James stood by the large window in his study, staring out at the city lights. His thoughts were fragmented, circling the same questions without resolution. Linda, no Bella. The possibility gnawed at him. Her face, her mannerisms, even the way she spoke. It wasn't just that she resembled his Bella. It was that her name, her existence, was now entangled with his wife's death in a way he couldn't ignore. He turned sharply and grabbed his phone from the desk, his fingers moving instinctively as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Jackson?" the voice said, no trace of familiarity in its tone. "Detective?" James began, keeping his voice low. "It's James Stewart." There was a pause, then recognition. "Stewart, been a while. What can I do for you?" James hesitated. "I need you to look into something for me. It's about Bella." The next few days passed in a blur of silence and tension. Linda, though trying to maintain normalcy for Evelyn's sake, was visibly shaken. Her movements were hesitant, her usually calm demeanor fractured. She avoided James's gaze, and when they spoke, her voice carried the weight of uncertainty. James, on the other hand, was distant, observing, calculating, and waiting for Jackson's call. The unease gnawed at him. His love for Bella was a certainty, a fixed point in his life. Yet Linda's presence now felt like a mirror, reflecting both what he had lost and the tangled threads of something he couldn't yet comprehend. By the third day, Jackson called back. James answered on the first ring, retreating to his study as Linda and Evelyn played in the living room. "Stewart," Jackson began without preamble, "you were right to call." James gripped the phone tighter. "What did you find?" "It wasn't an accident," Jackson said grimly. "Bella's death, it was deliberate, a hit." James's breath caught. He leaned heavily on the desk. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone ordered that crash," Jackson continued, "but they weren't after her. It was a case of mistaken identity." The words slammed into James like a physical blow. He sank into the chair, his head spinning. Who were they after? There was a pause on the line, as if Jackson was weighing how much to reveal. "Linda Crawford," he said finally, "or as it seems, Bella Martinez." The room tilted. James gripped the edge of the desk, struggling to process the detective's words. "Francis," he muttered, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "Yeah, a big name in the underworld," Jackson confirmed. Francis thought he was targeting Martinez's kid. Instead, he killed your wife." James's jaw clenched, his free hand curling into a fist. The edges of his vision blurred with anger, sorrow, and the sickening realization that Bella had died because of someone else's vendetta. A vendetta aimed at the woman now sleeping under his roof. That evening, James sat alone in the darkened study. The photograph of Bella on the bookshelf seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, her smile frozen in time. His chest ached with a familiar hollowness, but now it was accompanied by a sharp edge of rage. Linda's quiet knock broke the silence. She stepped inside cautiously, holding a mug of tea. "You've been in here all evening," she said softly. "I thought you might need this." James didn't respond immediately. He stared at the mug in her hands, then at her face. So similar, yet so painfully different from Bella's. "Why didn't you tell me more about your past?" he asked abruptly. His tone wasn't accusing, but it wasn't gentle either. Linda froze, her fingers tightening around the mug. I don't know much to tell," she admitted. "Everything Kenneth said, it's as new to me as it is to you." James leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Your presence here, it's not coincidence." "What do you mean?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bella's death wasn't an accident," James said flatly, his eyes locking onto hers. "She died because of Francis. He was after you." The mug slipped from Linda's hands, shattering on the floor. Her face went pale as she stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "No," she whispered. "That can't be—" "It is," James said firmly. "She was mistaken for you. And now, because of your past, because of your connection to Francis, she's gone." Tears streamed down Linda's face as she shook her head, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't ask for this." James rose from his chair, his posture tense. "Neither did she," he said, his voice tight with grief and anger. "But she paid the price." Linda covered her mouth, a sob escaping as she staggered back. James's words cut deep, and the guilt that had been simmering within her now felt unbearable. As she fled the room, James sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The house, once filled with the sound of Evelyn's laughter, now felt oppressively quiet. The revelation had unraveled everything, leaving behind only pain, anger, and unanswered questions. The morning after their confrontation, the tension in the penthouse was suffocating. Linda kept close to Evelyn, her movements quick and deliberate as she packed their few belongings. Her face was pale, her expression grim, and she avoided James's gaze entirely. Evelyn sensed the unease, but said nothing, clinging to her mother's side with quiet obedience. James watched them from the kitchen, his coffee untouched. The weight of their argument the night before sat heavily on his shoulders, but he couldn't find the words to bridge the distance he had created. His grief for Bella and his anger at Linda's past churned inside him, creating an uncontrollable storm. Douglas Stewart arrived unannounced, as he often did. The older man stepped into the room, his sharp eyes immediately noting the packed bags near the door. He looked at James, then Linda, his frown deepening. "What's going on here?" Douglas's question cut through the silence. Linda stiffened but didn't respond. James set his mug down and met his father's gaze. "Linda's leaving," he said simply. "Leaving?" Douglas's voice sharpened. Douglas's voice grew sharper. "Yes," Linda said quietly, stepping forward. "It's for the best." "For the best?" Douglas scoffed. His eyes narrowed on Linda. "After everything that's come to light, after what your presence here has done to this family." He turned to James. "You can't seriously believe this woman deserves—" "Enough," James interrupted. his tone low and firm. He rarely raised his voice to his father, but the look in his eyes silenced Douglas immediately. "She's leaving. That's her decision." Linda glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. There was no gratitude in her expression, only resignation. However, Douglas was far from finished. "You're letting her go? Just like that? After what she cost us?" His voice cracked slightly, a rare fissure in his otherwise steely demeanor. "Bella's death—" "Stop!" James snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "This isn't her fault." Douglas's silence was deafening, his disapproval hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Linda turned away, gripping Evelyn's hand as she knelt beside her daughter. "We should go," she whispered. James stepped closer, his voice softer, but no less resolute. "Linda, you don't have to do this." Linda straightened, her eyes meeting his for the first time that day. They were red-rimmed, but steady. "I do," she said firmly. "You've been through enough because of me. Staying here would only make it worse." James opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. He knew she believed what she was saying, and in truth, he couldn't be certain she was wrong. Later that afternoon, Kenneth arrived to escort Linda and Evelyn back to New York. He entered the penthouse with his usual air of authority, but his expression was softer, touched with regret as he approached his daughter. "Are you ready?" Kenneth asked gently. Linda nodded, picking up her bags. She avoided looking at James as she moved toward the elevator, but Evelyn hesitated. She turned to James, her small face creased with worry. "Will you come with us, Mr. James?" she asked innocently. James's throat tightened. He crouched to her level, offering a small smile. "Not this time, Evelyn," he said softly. "But you'll be safe, okay? I promise." Evelyn nodded, though her lower lip trembled. Linda placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her into the elevator. As the doors began to close, James caught Linda's gaze one last time. There was something unspoken between them, a mixture of regret, gratitude, and pain. Then they vanished. If you hear this and feel curious about the final details of the story, please leave a comment Teddy as a greeting to the author of this story. Now, we continue listening. The SUV Kenneth had arranged waited near the curb. Linda settled Evelyn into the back seat, her heart heavy. Kenneth climbed in beside her, his expression tense as he gave the driver a nod. The vehicle pulled into the snowy streets, the city lights beginning to blur as they left the skyline behind. Linda glanced out the window, her thoughts a jumble of fragmented memories and the weight of her goodbye to James. Evelyn leaned against her, her small hand clutching Linda's jacket. It happened in an instant. The sharp screech of tires, the slam of another vehicle into their side, and the sudden chaos of shouts and shattered glass all happened in an instant. Linda screamed, shielding Evelyn as the SUV spun to a halt. Masked men wrenched open the doors. Kenneth struggled to defend Linda and Evelyn, yet he found himself overwhelmed. Evelyn was ripped from Linda's arms, her cries piercing the freezing air as the men dragged her into another car. "No!" Linda shrieked and ran after them, but one of the men pushed her down. They restrained Kenneth, causing his face to pale with fury and fear. The kidnappers sped off, their taillights disappearing into the dark. Linda stumbled to her feet, her body trembling with adrenaline and terror. "Evelyn!" she sobbed, her voice breaking. Kenneth pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed frantically. "We'll find her," he said, though his voice wavered. "I swear we'll get her back." Linda collapsed against him, her chest heaving with sobs. The distant wail of sirens filled the air. But to her, the world had already fallen silent. Evelyn was gone, and the weight of her past had come crashing down on her present. Linda sat in a cold, sterile room at the local police station, her hands trembling around the disposable coffee cup someone had thrust into them. She hadn't taken a sip. Kenneth paced behind her, his phone glued to his ear, barking orders to what sounded like half the state's law enforcement and his private security team. But nothing mattered. The frantic calls and the promises of uniformed officers made no difference. Only Evelyn mattered. Evelyn was no longer with us. Her phone buzzed on the metal table, startling her. She snatched it up, hope flashing briefly in her eyes. It wasn't Evelyn. It wasn't the police. It was James. She hesitated. Their last conversation echoed in her mind, his anger, his pain, and the cold finality of her decision to leave. But now, desperation overshadowed her pride, her guilt, and her determination to stay out of his life. "James," she said, as soon as she answered, her voice shaking. "What happened?" Though calm, his voice was sharp and urgent. "They took her," Linda choked out, her breath hitching. "Francis's men. They took Evelyn." There was silence on the other end, and then James's voice, low and controlled. "Where are you?" Linda gave him the address, her words tumbling over one another. "Please. I didn't know who else to call. I'm on my way," James interrupted. "Don't move." It didn't take long. James strode into the station less than 30 minutes later, his jaw set, his movements purposeful. He found Linda and Kenneth in a private meeting room, a frazzled officer standing awkwardly near the door. "James," Linda began, rising from her seat. Tears streaked her face, her eyes rimmed in red. "I didn't know—" He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Tell me everything." Kenneth stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. "We were on our way to the airport. A car rammed us off the road, and before we could react, they took Evelyn. They knew exactly what they were doing." James's eyes narrowed. "Francis." Kenneth nodded grimly. "There's no doubt. He knows who Linda is, and now he's using Evelyn to get to us." Linda's hands clenched into fists. "I can't lose her, James. I can't." Her voice broke, and she sank back into the chair. "You won't," James said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "We'll get her back." The call came hours later. Linda's teeth twitched at the cold, calm voice on the other end. "I have the girl," the man said without preamble. "She's safe, for now." "Where is she?" Linda demanded, her voice trembling with both rage and terror. "That depends," the man replied. "You know what I want." Kenneth grabbed the phone from Linda's hands. "Francis," he growled. "You bastard." "Save the theatrics," Francis interrupted smoothly. "I don't want her hurt. But you know how this works. Heather hid something from me. You can refer to it as documents or evidence. I want it, Martinez. If I don't have it by midnight tomorrow, I will not accept it." He let the threat hang in the air. "We don't know where it is," Kenneth said, his voice tight with frustration. "Then you'd better start looking," Francis replied. The line went dead. Linda's legs gave out, and she slumped into the nearest chair. Her heart raced, her mind spinning with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. James' voice pierced through the chaos with a sharp edge. "We find those documents, and we get Evelyn back." Kenneth looked at him, his brows furrowed. "You don't even know what we're dealing with. You're not—" "I'm involved now," James snapped. His expression darkened, his grief and fury intertwining into something unyielding. "Francis took Evelyn because of you. It was due to her, and I'm not standing by while a child pays the price." Linda looked up at him, her eyes wide with both hope and guilt. "James, we don't have time for apologies," he said, his tone softening, but his resolve unshaken. "We'll sort everything out later. Right now, we need a plan." Kenneth nodded, his jaw tight. "I have some ideas on where Heather might have hidden the documents. We'll start with her old safe house." James pulled out his phone, already dialing. "I'll contact Jackson. If anyone can help us track down Francis, it's him." The stakes became painfully clear as the three of them gathered their resources. Time was against them. Francis's reach was vast, and every second wasted was a second Evelyn was in danger. Despite the fear and uncertainty, they were certain that they would not give up. They would continue until they ensured Evelyn's safety. Linda knew deep down that this was just the beginning. The old property Heather once owned was in Philadelphia, tucked away in a forgotten neighborhood, its exterior battered by time. The paint peeled from the walls, and overgrown weeds encroached on the crumbling driveway. Although the place exuded neglect, Kenneth saw it as a beacon, a place where he might finally find answers. James parked the car a block away. The group sat in tense silence, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. Linda gripped the edge of her seat, her nails digging into the upholstery as she gazed outward at the shadowy structure. "This is it?" James asked, his tone clipped, eyes scanning the surroundings. Kenneth nodded, his jaw set. "If Heather hid anything, it's here." Linda swallowed hard. Do you believe Francis knows about this place?" Kenneth's silence was answer enough. James stepped out first, the cold night air biting against his skin. His senses on high alert, he glanced up and down the street. "Let's move quickly," he said, his voice low. "If we're not the only ones looking, we don't have much time." The interior of the house was worse than the outside. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was thick with the musty scent of decay. Linda tried not to think about how the house mirrored her emotions, broken, hollow, and filled with the ghosts of a past she barely remembered. "This way," Kenneth said, leading them to what used to be a study. The furniture was sparse, the room dominated by a large weathered desk and a bookcase lined with faded tomes. He moved with urgency, pulling open drawers and rifling through their contents. James, meanwhile, examined the walls, tapping lightly as though searching for a hollow spot. Linda hovered near the doorway, her nerves fraying with every creak of the old floorboards. "It has to be here," Kenneth muttered. His hands moved faster, frustration evident in his jerky movements. "Calm down," James snapped. James's voice pierced the tension with a sharp edge. "Panicking won't help." "I'm not panicking," Kenneth bit back, though his eyes betrayed him. Linda spoke softly, her voice trembling. "Heather wouldn't have made it obvious. She'd hide it somewhere, only she knew to look." James turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing her words. "Did she ever mention this place to you? Anything about it?" Linda shook her head. "I was so young. Wait." She frowned, stepping further into the room. She used to hum this tune when she was working. Something about it was calming. I remember her standing by a wall tapping her fingers to the rhythm. Kenneth straightened, his gaze sharpening. "Which wall?" Linda scanned the room, her eyes landing on the farthest wall, partially obscured by a heavy cabinet. "There." Without hesitation, James and Kenneth began pushing the cabinet aside. Dust swirled in the air, and Linda coughed, covering her mouth as they revealed the bare plaster behind it. James pressed his hands against the surface, his fingers searching for an imperfection. "Here," he said suddenly. He pulled a small crowbar from the bag he'd brought and began prying at the plaster. Within minutes, the room echoed with the sound of cracking, unveiling a hidden compartment. Inside was a metal box, its surface worn, but intact. Kenneth grabbed it, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the latch. The lid creaked open, revealing a stack of papers, photographs, and a small USB drive. "This is it," Kenneth breathed, relief washing over his features. But the moment was short-lived. The distant sound of tires screeching to a halt outside snapped their attention to the window. James peered out, his face darkening. "We've got company." The house erupted into chaos. Francis's men stormed in, their footsteps pounding against the wooden floor. James and Kenneth moved quickly, barricading the door with a heavy chair. "We need to get out of here," Linda cried, clutching the documents to her chest. James grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a back exit. "Go, now!" They burst into the night, the cold air stinging their faces. The men gave chase, their shouts cutting through the darkness. James led the way, his knowledge of the neighborhood their only advantage. Kenneth stumbled, but recovered, shoving Linda ahead. "Keep running!" he barked. Shots rang out, shattering the eerie stillness of the night. Linda gasped, her grip on the documents tightening as adrenaline surged through her veins. James turned, his jaw clenched as he fired back with a gun he'd taken from one of Francis's men earlier. The group ducked into an alley, their breaths ragged and their movements frantic. A car screeched to a halt at the end of the alley, and a familiar voice called out, "Get in!" Jackson shouted from the driver's seat. Without hesitation, they piled into the car. Jackson hit the gas, the tires squealing as they sped away. The men behind them faded into the distance, their shouts drowned out by the roar of the engine. Hours later, they reconvened at a safe house James had arranged. The documents sat on the table between them, a silent reminder of what they had just endured. Linda clung to the edge of her chair, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. James stood by the window, his posture rigid as he scanned the street below. "We need to use this to bargain," he said finally. "Francis wants these documents. We'll make him trade." Kenneth nodded, his face grim. "It's our only option." Linda's voice was barely a whisper. Do you think Evelyn is okay?" James turned to her, his eyes softening for the first time that night. "We'll get her back," he said firmly, "no matter what it takes." The words offered little comfort, but they were all she had to hold on to. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, the group prepared for what lay ahead, knowing the hardest part was yet to come. The exchange took place in the dead of night. James, Linda, Kenneth, and Jackson stood at the edge of a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of Philadelphia, the cold wind biting at their exposed faces. The USB drive and documents, neatly packed in a secure folder, sat in James's gloved hands. The tension was suffocating as they scanned the shadows for any sign of Francis. "Stay close," James murmured to Linda, his voice low but steady. She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. Her heart pounded in her chest as her gaze darted between the darkened corners of the lot. She couldn't focus on anything except Evelyn, her laugh, her small hands, the way she clung to her at night. Linda tightened her grip on her coat, willing herself to stay upright. A single car approached, its headlights cutting through the dark. It stopped several yards away, the engine idling ominously. Francis emerged, his imposing figure flanked by two men who looked just as menacing. His smirk was sharp and cold, his eyes calculating as they landed on the group. "Let's get this over with," James said, his tone devoid of patience. Francis chuckled, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Mr. Stewart, you always get right to the point." "I admire that." One of his men opened the car's back door at his command. Evelyn emerged, her small figure wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide with fear. Linda's knees nearly buckled at the sight of her. She stepped forward, but James's hand shot out, gripping her arm to hold her back. "Not yet," he said softly. "Smart man," Francis said, his grin widening. "Here's how this works. You hand me the documents, and I hand over the girl. No tricks." Kenneth stepped forward, his face a mask of restrained fury. "You've already taken enough from my family. If you hurt her—" Francis cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Relax, Martinez. She's unharmed. For now." The words sent a chill through Linda. James handed the folder to Jackson, who walked toward Francis with deliberate slowness. The tension crackled in the air like static electricity. As soon as the folder exchanged hands, Francis inspected the contents, his grin fading into a satisfied smirk. He gave a nod, and one of his men released Evelyn, pushing her toward the group. "Mommy!" Evelyn cried, her tiny legs carrying her as fast as they could to Linda. Linda fell to her knees, catching her daughter and holding her so tightly that Evelyn squirmed slightly. "I've got you, baby," Linda whispered, her voice cracking. "I've got you." Francis gestured towards an imaginary hat. "Pleasure doing business." Before he could turn away, sirens blared in the distance. Francis's smirk vanished as flashing lights illuminated the lot. Jackson had subtly notified the authorities, leaving Francis and his men encircled. "You double-crossed me," Francis snarled, his eyes narrowing on James. "You kidnapped a child," James shot back, his voice cold. "What did you expect?" The officers moved quickly, apprehending Francis and his men. Dragged toward a squad car, Francis turned to Kenneth with a sneer. "This isn't over, Martinez. You'll never be free of me." Kenneth's expression didn't falter. "We'll see." Back at the safe house, the relief was palpable. Linda refused to let Evelyn out of her sight, holding her close as the little girl drifted to sleep on the couch. Kenneth stood by the window, his shoulders slumped under the weight of everything that had transpired. "I owe you an apology," Kenneth said quietly, turning to James, "for all of it. I am sorry for involving you in this situation, for what my mistakes cost you." James stared at him, his face unreadable. "Apologies won't bring Bella back," he said finally. Kenneth nodded, his jaw tightening. "No, they won't. But I can make sure her memory stands for something." He took a deep breath. "I'm selling everything, my properties, my shares. I'm establishing a foundation in Bella's name. The foundation will assist women and children who find themselves in similar situations to Linda and Evelyn's." Linda looked up, her eyes softening as she processed his words. That's incredible, Kenneth." "It's the least I can do," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I can't undo the past, but I can try to build something better for the future." In the weeks that followed, the Bella Stewart Foundation began to take shape. Linda threw herself into the work, pouring her energy into creating safe spaces for women and children affected by violence. It gave her a sense of purpose, a way to channel her pain into something meaningful. But while she found a new path, James remained distant. He visited the foundation once, offering quiet support but keeping his involvement minimal. His grief for Bella still loomed large, a shadow he couldn't escape. One evening, Linda found him standing by a window at the Foundation's headquarters, staring out at the city skyline. "You know, she'd be proud of you," Linda said softly, stepping beside him. James didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "Bella would have been proud of you too." Linda smiled faintly, but didn't press him further. She knew James's wounds ran deep, and healing would take time, if it ever came at all. As he left that night, walking into the cold, James glanced up at the stars. Bella's absence still weighed on him, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of peace. He had done what he could to protect those who mattered. The cemetery was quiet, blanketed in the kind of stillness only a cold winter morning could bring. Frost clung to the edges of headstones, shimmering faintly under the pale light of dawn. James stood at the entrance, a bouquet of white lilies in his hand, his breath visible in the icy air. He hadn't been here in months, not since the day they lowered Bella into the ground. Back then, grief had consumed him like an unrelenting storm, and every visit to her grave felt like reopening a wound. But today was different. Today, he came not just with sorrow, but with purpose. He walked slowly, his shoes crunching against the frozen grass. Her headstone came into view, simple and elegant, just as she would have wanted. Bella Stewart, beloved wife, forever in our hearts. James knelt, placing the lilies gently at the base of the stone. For a long moment, he said nothing, his fingers tracing the letters of her name. His chest tightened, but he took a deep breath, letting the air sting his lungs. "Hi, Bella," he began, his voice steady but soft. "It's been a while." The wind rustled through the barren trees, the only response to his words. He smiled faintly, imagining her teasing him for taking so long to visit. I've been busy," he continued. "Things got complicated. The complexity of the situation exceeded my initial expectations." He paused, his brow furrowing. "You'd laugh if you knew the whole story. Or maybe you wouldn't. You always did have a way of seeing through the mess." James leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. "Linda is not who I thought she was. Her past, now, intertwines with mine. It's also intertwined with yours." I struggled for a considerable amount of time to determine my appropriate response to that situation. He let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm still figuring it out." His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight peeked through the clouds. "But you'd have liked her," he admitted. "She's strong, like you were. Stubborn, too." He smirked at the thought, his expression softening. "And Evelyn, she's something else. She reminds me that there's still kindness in the world, even when it's difficult to see." The wind picked up, ruffling his coat as he shifted slightly. His face grew somber. "I can't lie to you, Bella. I don't think I'll ever stop missing you. I don't think I'll ever stop loving you. You are my heart." His voice broke slightly, but he cleared his throat, regaining control. "But I think I finally understand what you'd want for me. You'd want me to live, wouldn't you? To find a way to keep going, not just for myself, but for the people I can still help." He reached out, brushing frost from the top of the headstone. "Kenneth started a foundation in your name," he said. "Linda's working with it now. They're helping people, women and children, find safety, find hope. I think you'd approve." James reclined on his heels, his expression thoughtful. "I'll keep coming here. I'll keep bringing you flowers. However, I believe I'm prepared to embark on a new chapter of life. I will never forget you, but to honor you." He stood, brushing off his coat. The lilies swayed slightly in the breeze, their pale petals stark against the frost-covered grass. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice firm, "for loving me. Thank you for allowing me to love you. I'll carry that with me, always." For a moment, he stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. Then, with one last glance at the headstone, he turned and walked back toward the cemetery gates. As he stepped onto the gravel path leading to his car, the sun broke fully through the clouds, casting the world in a soft, golden light. James paused, closing his eyes and tilting his face toward the warmth. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his chest lightened, if only slightly. Bella's absence would always linger, a quiet ache in the background of his life. But today, he felt something else, something close to peace. And as he drove away from the cemetery, he resolved to carry that feeling with him, one step at a time. The Bella Stewart Foundation was bustling with activity, a testament to months of hard work and determination. The main office, housed in a refurbished brownstone in the heart of the city, radiated warmth and hope. The walls featured framed photographs of women and children the foundation had helped, serving as a silent yet powerful reminder of its mission. Linda stood in the main lobby, her hands full of donation forms. She was beaming as Evelyn darted around the room, a burst of energy and giggles. Watching her daughter thrive, free from the shadows of their past, filled Linda with a gratitude she could never fully express. Kenneth entered from the adjacent meeting room, his expression thoughtful but content. "We secured the partnership," he announced, his voice carrying a note of pride. "The funding will keep us operational for the next 3 years." Linda turned to him, her smile widening. "That's incredible, Kenneth. Bella's name is becoming a beacon for so many." He nodded, his gaze softening as it landed on the plaque by the entrance that read, "The Bella Stewart Foundation, building safety, one life at a time." Later that afternoon, Linda and Evelyn met James at a park near the foundation. The air was crisp, and the trees, though bare, framed the playground beautifully. Evelyn squealed with delight as she raced toward the swings, her scarf trailing behind her like a cape. James leaned against the back of a bench, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He watched Evelyn, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "She's happy," he said. "She's safe," Linda replied, taking a seat beside him. "After a long time." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the distant sound of children playing filling the air. Despite everything that had happened, there was an ease between them now, a mutual respect that didn't need words. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel peace again," Linda admitted, her voice low. "After everything with Francis, I thought maybe it wasn't possible." James glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Peace isn't something you find all at once," he said. "It's something you build, piece by piece." Linda nodded, watching Evelyn climb onto a swing. "You've helped more than you realize, James." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on Evelyn as she kicked her legs, trying to gain momentum on the swing. "She's a reminder," he said finally, "that there's still good in the world, even after everything it takes from you." Linda smiled faintly. "Bella would have liked her." "She would have loved her," James said softly. His voice held no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in hues of orange and gold, Evelyn ran back to them, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Look, Mr. James," she exclaimed, holding out a handful of leaves she had gathered. "Aren't they pretty?" James crouched to her level, taking the leaves with a small smile. "They're perfect," he said, his tone warm. "Just like you." Evelyn giggled, throwing her arms around his neck in a spontaneous hug. James momentarily froze, taken by surprise, but then he returned the embrace, his expression softening. Linda watched the scene unfold, her heart full. She knew James's grief for Bella would never fully fade, but moments like these showed her that healing wasn't impossible. It just took time. As the park emptied and the sun began to set, James stayed behind, sitting on the bench, while Linda and Evelyn headed back to the foundation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and watched the sky darken. He thought of Bella, as he often did. Her laughter, her determination, the way she made every room she entered feel brighter. Even though she was no longer with him, the love she had bestowed upon him continued to burn brightly, influencing every decision he made. Evelyn's laughter echoed in his mind, overlapping with memories of Bella's. He smiled to himself, the ache in his chest dulling slightly. His heart was still hers, and always would be. But now there was space for something else, a quiet resolve to live meaningfully for the people still in his life. As the last light faded from the sky, James rose from the bench, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. He slipped his hands into his coat pockets and began walking. The weight of Bella's absence, still there, but no longer unbearable. Life had taken much from him, but it had also given him new connections, unexpected and imperfect, but beautiful in their own way. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.